Humans were smoking long before cigarettes existed, long before tobacco companies, long before warnings on packaging. The urge to inhale burning plants goes back further than most civilizations you were ever taught about. And the reasons? Not what you'd expect. Let's go back. Not to the 1800s, not to ancient Rome. Much further, there is archaeological evidence suggesting humans were deliberately inhaling smoke from burning plants at least 5,000 years ago, and possibly much earlier. The earliest confirmed evidence comes from burial sites in the Pamir Mountains, the region where modern China, Tajikistan, and Afghanistan converge. In 2019, researchers published findings in the journal Science Advances. They found wooden braziers, small burning vessels, inside ancient tombs. Inside those braziers, residue, burned cannabis residue, with THC levels significantly higher than wild cannabis plants normally produce. This wasn't an accident. Someone chose high-potency plants. Someone put them in a container made for burning. Someone breathed it in. On purpose. These tombs are dated to around 500 BCE. That puts deliberate cannabis inhalation firmly in the ancient world, over 2,500 years ago. But here's what makes this strange. The context wasn't recreational, it was ritual. These were funeral ceremonies. Scholars believe the smoke was part of communicating with the dead, or guiding the soul, or simply processing grief in a way that made the invisible feel reachable. So the oldest confirmed smoking ritual we know of wasn't about pleasure, it was about death. Now, Herodotus, Greek historian, writing in the 5th century BCE. He described something that, for a long time, people thought was just exaggeration. Herodotus described the Scythians, nomadic warriors from the Eurasian steppe, throwing hemp seeds onto red-hot stones inside enclosed tents. He said they howled with pleasure, screamed with delight at the vapors. He described it the way someone describes something almost alarming. For centuries, historians weren't sure if this was real or just Greek embellishment. Then the Pamir findings showed up. Herodotus had been telling the truth. That's not a small thing. That's a 2,500-year-old written account being confirmed by physical evidence in 2019. That gap. Think about it. But even this isn't the beginning, because before the Scythians, before the tombs, there was fire itself. Humans have controlled fire for roughly 400,000 years, maybe longer, and fire produces smoke. Smoke enters lungs. Every fire user was technically a smoker, but passive inhalation around a campfire isn't the same as deliberate smoking. The distinction matters. At some point, someone made a choice, and that choice likely started with shamans, healers, people whose job it was to cross between the ordinary world and whatever they believed lay beyond it. Psychoactive plants, plants that alter consciousness, grew wild across nearly every continent. Humans found them, observed animals eating them, and experimented. There's a theory sometimes called the stoned ape hypothesis, proposed by ethnobotanist Terence McKenna in the 1990s, that psychedelic plants catalyzed human cognition. That hypothesis is controversial. Mainstream science is skeptical, but what isn't controversial is that ancient humans clearly sought altered states, and smoke was one path. Now let's talk about tobacco specifically, because tobacco is what most people picture when they hear the word smoking. Tobacco is native to the Americas, and the indigenous peoples of the Americas were smoking it for an extraordinarily long time before Europeans arrived. How long? Researchers analyzing dental plaque from ancient human remains in the American Southwest found tobacco biomarkers in teeth dating back 3,000 years. But the pipe evidence is even older. Pipes designed specifically for smoking have been found across the Americas dating to around 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, some possibly older. And among many indigenous cultures, tobacco wasn't casual. It was sacred. It was medicine. It was protocol. You offered tobacco before asking for anything. The pipe itself, the peace pipe, wasn't a symbol of relaxation. It was a legal and spiritual instrument. Agreements made over it carried weight. When Europeans made contact with the Americas in the late 1400s, They encountered tobacco smoking and had very different reactions. Some were fascinated, some were horrified. Christopher Columbus's crew members were among the first Europeans to witness it and brought tobacco back to Spain. Within decades, tobacco spread across Europe, then the Ottoman Empire, then Asia. The speed was remarkable. Addiction has always been an excellent engine of trade. By the early 1600s, tobacco was being grown in England, smoked in Turkey, and traded in China. In under 150 years, it had gone genuinely global. Back to the ancient world for a moment, because we haven't yet talked about a plant that might push the smoking timeline even further back. Datura, also called Jimson weed, thorn apple, devil's trumpet, wildly psychoactive, toxic in high doses, and ancient. Researchers studying a ritual cave site in Spain, Cueva de los Murciélagos, found datura seeds dating back approximately 5,000 to 6,000 years. Were they burned, smoked, or eaten? The record isn't perfectly clear, but the deliberate placement in a ritual context strongly suggests intentional use. And datura has a documented history of use by shamans across the Americas, Europe, and Asia, independently. Multiple cultures discovered it, used it, and feared it. There's something unsettling about that pattern. A dangerous plant discovered over and over again by people who had never met each other. It suggests the drive to alter consciousness through smoke, through plants, through ritual, isn't cultural. It might be something deeper, something human. Andrew Weil, physician and author, argued in his 1972 book The Natural Mind that the desire for altered states is a basic human drive, like hunger or sex. Not a weakness, not a flaw. A drive, something built into the architecture of being human. Smoke was just one very ancient way of answering that drive. Let's shift to ancient Egypt, because Egypt has something interesting to offer here, and it involves mummies. In the early 1990s, German researcher Svetlana Balabanova analyzed the tissue of Egyptian mummies and found something deeply unexpected: traces of nicotine and cocaine in mummies dating back over 3,000 years. Nicotine from tobacco plants, cocaine from coca leaves, both native to the Americas. This caused immediate academic uproar, because if the finding is correct, it means ancient Egyptians somehow had access to American plants, 3,000 years before Columbus. The mainstream explanation offered is contamination. Modern tobacco or cocaine somehow entered the mummy tissues during excavation or storage. That's the most accepted view. But Balabanova and her colleagues stood by their findings. And this question, the Egyptian nicotine mystery, has never been fully resolved. Come back to solid ground. Let's talk about what we know for certain about how smoking spread and why it exploded. When tobacco arrived in Europe, the first reaction wasn't addiction, it was medicine. Physicians thought it cured headaches, toothaches, bad breath, tumors. Jean Nicot, French ambassador to Portugal in the 1560s, promoted tobacco as a wonder drug and sent it to the French court. His name became the word nicotine. Meanwhile, the first serious voice of opposition came from, of all people, a king. King James I of England wrote a counterblast to tobacco in 1604. He called smoking a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs. He raised taxes on tobacco by 4,000%. It didn't work. People kept smoking, the tax revenue became too useful, the addiction was too strong, and tobacco plantations were already transforming economies. In fact, tobacco is one of the key drivers behind the transatlantic slave trade. The labor demand of tobacco plantations was catastrophic in its consequences. So smoking, this thing that started as a funeral ritual in Central Asian mountains, became entangled with some of the worst chapters in human history. Back to the ancient world one more time, because there's a region we haven't visited yet, ancient India, The Vedic texts, some of the oldest written texts on Earth dating back possibly 3,500 years, reference something called soma. Soma was a ritual drink, possibly also inhaled as smoke. Its exact identity has been debated for over a century. Some researchers think it was cannabis. Others suggest ephedra or amanita mushrooms. The Rig Veda, one of the oldest surviving texts in any Indo-European language, describes soma as a god, a drink, and a transcendent experience. All three, simultaneously. R. Gordon Wasson, in his 1968 book Soma, Divine Mushroom of Immortality, argued the plant was Amanita muscaria, the red and white spotted fly agaric mushroom. Whether soma was smoked, drunk, or both remains genuinely unresolved. But the principle is consistent. Ancient humans were constantly, deliberately seeking altered states through plants. Let's move forward in time. Ancient China. The earliest Chinese medical text, the Shenong Bencao Jing, references cannabis use dating back roughly 2,700 years. Shenong, the mythical divine farmer, is credited with tasting hundreds of plants to discover their properties. The text describes cannabis as a medicine for over 100 ailments. But the Chinese medical tradition also developed fumigation, burning herbs near a patient, as a treatment method. Breathing the smoke was part of the cure. And here's a fascinating wrinkle. Archaeological evidence from ancient China suggests cannabis was being burned in ritual contexts as far back as 2,500 years ago. The 2019 Science Advances paper we mentioned earlier, that study covered burials from the Zherzhankou Cemetery in the Pamir region of western China, right at the Silk Road crossroads. That location matters. The Silk Road connected east and west for centuries. Whatever habits or plants existed, they didn't stay local. They traveled. Now, a genuinely weird piece of this story, ancient Greece, and a woman named the Pythia, the Oracle of Delphi. The most famous prophet in the ancient world. Kings, generals, and philosophers traveled for weeks to ask her questions. She would enter a trance and answer. For centuries, scholars assumed this was theater, performance, until geologists in the late 1990s investigated the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. They found intersecting geological fault lines beneath the temple, faults that could release ethylene gas. Ethylene produces trance-like states when inhaled. The oracle was real. Not smoke exactly, but gas inhalation for prophetic purposes. The principle, breathe something, reach somewhere beyond ordinary consciousness, is the same. This pattern shows up everywhere. Across every continent, across every era, smoke as bridge, smoke as medicine, smoke as communication with the unseen. The Mayans were smoking tobacco in carved pipes as far back as the 9th century CE. It appears in their art, their gods, their calendars. The god Ah-Puch, Mayan god of death, was often depicted smoking. Again, smoke and death, linked across cultures that never spoke to each other. In the Amazon basin, indigenous peoples have practiced tobacco shamanism for thousands of years. In some traditions, the healer doesn't eat, they smoke, for days, deliberately. The Shipibo Konibo, the Yawanapi, the Yanomami. Tobacco in these traditions is not a vice. It's a tool, a precision instrument for navigating the spirit world, which makes what happened after 1492 even more striking. Europeans took tobacco from these careful, structured traditions and turned it into mass commercial addiction. The cigarette, the modern cigarette, is actually a very late invention. The rolled cigarette as we know it wasn't mass-produced until the late 1800s. James Bonsack invented a cigarette rolling machine in 1880. One machine could produce 120,000 cigarettes per day. Within a decade, smoking became truly industrial. And with industrialization came something ancient shamans never intended: addiction at population scale. By the mid-20th century, half of all American adults smoked. So how do we draw the line from funeral braziers in the Pamir Mountains to Marlboro billboards in Times Square? The answer is very carefully, and with a kind of awe, because what starts as a 2,500-year-old ritual act of grief and transcendence becomes, across centuries, a global industry worth over $800 billion a year. And yet the original impulse, the oldest one, the one carved into the rock record and ancient texts, was not commercial. It was spiritual. It was searching. There's something worth sitting with there. Every cigarette lit today carries, somewhere impossibly far back in its ancestry, someone standing over a brazier asking the smoke for something. An answer. A presence. A way through grief. A conversation with whatever comes next. So when did ancient humans start smoking? The hard answer, we don't know the exact moment. We may never know. What we know is that 2,500 years ago, confirmed, people were deliberately inhaling high-potency cannabis smoke in ritual settings. That tobacco was sacred in the Americas for thousands of years before Europeans arrived. That plants and smoke appear in virtually every ancient culture's spiritual record. And that the act of inhaling smoke, voluntarily, is one of the oldest documented human behaviors that isn't strictly about survival. It's about meaning, about reaching, about the very human refusal to accept that ordinary consciousness is the only mode available. Whether that's wisdom or folly probably depends on what you find on the other side of the smoke. And nobody who went looking has ever fully come back to explain it. If you want to go deeper, the 2019 Science Advances paper by Wren et al. Is freely available. Herodotus' histories are still in print. Andrew Weil's The Natural Mind is worth your time. Thanks for watching. Stay curious, and maybe, just this once, don't breathe in.